You know their names, their faces, their legacies, but what if I told you half of them almost never made it to the office at all? One was shot in the chest and gave a 90-minute speech anyway. Another survived because a woman grabbed an assassin's arm at the exact right moment. One nearly died from a rabbit. Sort of. It's complicated. Welcome to a 2-hour journey through the near misses, close calls, and bizarre twists of fate that kept American presidents alive long enough to actually be presidents. From George Washington's doctors accidentally draining him to death, to Joe Biden surviving a pandemic that statistically should have killed him. This is the history they didn't teach you in school. Because honestly, it's too weird to fit in a textbook. So get comfortable, dim the lights, let your mind wander through the strange, ironic, and oddly soothing reality that American history pivoted on mushroom poisoning, failed assassins, and one particularly aggressive swamp rabbit. Before we begin, if you enjoy falling asleep to weird history, subscribe and hit the notification bell. We do this kind of thing every week, and your algorithm needs to know you're the type of person who finds presidential near-death experiences relaxing. Let's start at the beginning, with the father of the nation and the doctors who nearly ended America before it even started. George Washington, the Hickey Plot, America's first assassination attempt. So here's a question to ponder as you drift off. What if America's first president had been assassinated before he was even president? Before there was a country to be president of? It's June 1776. Washington is in New York City, commanding the Continental Army, and the Declaration of Independence hasn't even been signed yet. America doesn't exist. It's still just a collection of angry colonists with organizational skills, and someone is trying to kill George Washington. Multiple someones, actually. The plot is discovered almost by accident, the way most terrible plots are. A Continental soldier tries to pass counterfeit money. He gets arrested, and while he's in custody, he starts talking, probably to reduce his own sentence, and mentions something about a conspiracy, a big one, involving the lifeguard. The lifeguard is Washington's personal security detail, his bodyguards, the people literally trusted with keeping him alive. And according to this counterfeiter, several of them are planning to kill him. The investigation moves fast. They arrest members of the lifeguard, interrogate them, and the plot unfolds like a spy novel written by someone who's not very good at spy novels. The conspiracy involves British loyalists, New York's mayor, and a plan to assassinate Washington right before the British attack New York. The goal is to decapitate the revolution, literally, before it can gain momentum. The ringleader on the American side is Thomas Hickey, one of Washington's own guards. Hickey and his co-conspirators had multiple plans: poison Washington's food, shoot him during battle, stab him in his sleep. They couldn't quite agree on the method, which is either reassuring or terrifying depending on how you look at it. The plot is real enough that Congress takes it seriously. Hickey goes to trial. He's convicted of sedition and mutiny, and on June 28th, 1776, just days before the Declaration of Independence is signed, he's hanged in front of 20,000 people. It's the first execution authorized by Washington as commander, and it's meant to send a message. This revolution is serious, and betrayal has consequences. Now, here's the uncomfortable part. We don't actually know how close they got. The plot was disrupted before any assassination attempt was made. But the conspirators were inside Washington's security detail. They had access. They had opportunity. If the counterfeiter hadn't been caught, if he hadn't talked, if the investigation had moved slower, Washington could have died in the summer of 1776, before independence was declared, before the nation existed, before anyone knew if this whole revolution thing would actually work. And then what? Who leads the Continental Army? Who becomes the unifying figure that holds 13 fractious colonies together? The revolution had other capable generals, sure, but none with Washington's combination of military skill, political savvy, and the sheer symbolic weight of being George Washington. The British knew this. That's why they backed the plot. Take out Washington, and maybe the whole thing falls apart. Maybe the colonists lose faith. Maybe individual colonies start negotiating separate peace deals. Maybe America never happens. But it didn't work. Because a counterfeiter wanted to cut a deal. Because the investigation moved quickly. Because Thomas Hickey couldn't keep his mouth shut while drunk in a tavern. America's first president survived America's first presidential assassination plot. Before he was president. Before there was a presidency. Before the country existed. Washington wrote about it later with characteristic understatement, noting the plot's discovery was providential, which is George Washington's way of saying that was way too close, and I'm not thinking about it anymore. The father of the nation almost died at the hands of his own bodyguards, killed by men he trusted before the nation was born. History turned on a counterfeiter's confession and a drunk conspirator's loose lips. And if that doesn't make you think about how fragile these historical moments are, how easily everything could have gone differently, then you're probably already asleep, which is exactly what we're going for. Though, speaking of betrayal and fragile moments, John Adams, the explosion that could have killed the revolution's voice, 1798. John Adams had a problem, and that problem was France. Well, technically, the problem was that America and France were sort of at war, but also sort of not at war, in that special way that lets politicians avoid calling it a war while ships blow each other up anyway. Historians call it the Quasi War, which sounds like something you'd name a indie band, but was actually a very real naval conflict that lasted from 1798 to 1800. Here's what happened. France was angry that America had signed a treaty with Britain, the Jay Treaty, which France interpreted as America choosing sides. France responded by seizing American merchant ships, hundreds of them. America responded by building a navy basically from scratch and sending it after French vessels. Adams, our second president, and a man who deeply loved both laws and arguing, found himself in the awkward position of conducting a military conflict without actually asking Congress to declare war. The Constitution is pretty clear about who gets to declare war. Congress, not the president, but Adams, in what we might generously call an expansive interpretation of executive power, authorized naval actions, commissioned privateers, and essentially conducted foreign policy as if he had a blank check. Congress went along with it, mostly, but the tension was palpable. You could cut it with a knife, assuming that knife was forged from passive-aggressive committee meetings and barely suppressed constitutional anxiety. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but where's the near-death experience? Adams wasn't exactly dodging cannonballs, and you'd be right. Adams's brush with mortality wasn't physical, it was political. Because if Congress had decided to push back harder, if they'd called his bluff and demanded he cease military operations, if they'd moved to impeach him for executive overreach, the entire structure of the early presidency could have collapsed. The thing is, nobody really knew how powerful the president was supposed to be yet. Washington had set precedents, sure, but Washington was Washington. He could have declared himself king, and half the country would have shrugged and said, yeah, okay, that tracks. Adams was not Washington. Adams was short, temperamental, and had the political charisma of a particularly argumentative lawyer, which, to be fair, is exactly what he was. The Federalist Party was fracturing. Alexander Hamilton, who was supposed to be on Adams's side, was actively undermining him behind the scenes, writing pamphlets about how Adams was unfit for office. The Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, Adams's own vice president, because the electoral system in 1796 was beautifully dysfunctional, were accusing Adams of monarchical ambitions. The Alien and Sedition Acts, which Adams signed into law during this period, made it illegal to criticize the government, which is exactly the kind of thing you do when you're totally confident in your democratic legitimacy and not at all worried about dissent. If Britain had decided to intervene in the Quasi War on France's side, or if American states had started refusing to fund the naval buildup, Adams's presidency could have imploded. The federal government could have lost credibility. State governments might have started acting more independently, treating federal authority as optional. The whole experiment could have unraveled, proving that you can't actually run a republic without consensus, clear rules, and people willing to follow them. But it didn't, mostly because Adams, for all his flaws, actually wanted peace. He sent diplomats to France in 1799, negotiating the Convention of 1800, which ended the Quasi War and preserved American neutrality. It was the right call diplomatically and probably saved his legacy historically, even though it destroyed his re-election chances politically. The Federalist Party never forgave him for choosing peace over partisan advantage. He lost to Jefferson in 1800, left office bitter and resentful, and spent the next 2 decades writing increasingly cranky letters about how nobody appreciated his sacrifice. Adams didn't dodge a bullet. He dodged a constitutional crisis, a potential fracturing of the Union, and the kind of executive overreach that might have set a precedent for future presidents to just do whatever they wanted during vague foreign conflicts, which, depending on your view of American history, either worked out great or is still a problem we're dealing with. A president nearly sunk by the very navy he created. Irony, as always, remains undefeated. But if Adams barely survived politics, Jefferson barely survived his own experiments. Thomas Jefferson, The Poison Feast, 1801 to 1809. Thomas Jefferson was a man of many talents: architect, inventor, philosopher, author of the Declaration of Independence, and, unfortunately, enthusiastic amateur botanist with what modern doctors would call a concerning lack of caution around unidentified plants. You have to understand, Jefferson believed in science the way some people believe in horoscopes, completely, uncritically, and with occasional disastrous results. He was convinced that rational inquiry and careful observation could unlock the secrets of nature. He kept meticulous gardens at Monticello. He imported seeds from around the world. He experimented with crop rotation, soil composition, and agricultural innovation. He also, apparently, occasionally ate things he probably shouldn't have. The historical record on this is scattered but consistent. Jefferson's personal letters describe multiple episodes of severe gastrointestinal distress during his presidency. We're talking about a man who wrote to his doctor about violent sickness after consuming wild mushrooms foraged from his own property. Wild mushrooms that he picked himself while president of the United States. Now, to be fair to Jefferson, mushroom identification was not exactly a well-developed science in the early 1800s. Field guides were unreliable. Knowledge was passed down through trial and error, and sometimes the error part involved death. But still, Jefferson was not some rural farmer with limited options. He was the president. He had access to cultivated, definitely not poisonous food. He could have just eaten normal vegetables. But no. Jefferson wanted the authentic experience, the connection to the land, the romantic ideal of living in harmony with nature. Nature, it turns out, was trying to kill him. The mushroom incident was bad enough, but Jefferson's dietary experiments didn't stop there. He foraged wild herbs that he couldn't always identify. He ate berries from unfamiliar plants. His gardens included experimental crops that sometimes produced unexpected results. His letters mentioned symptoms consistent with food poisoning, severe cramping, fever, chills, weakness lasting for days. Any one of these episodes could have been fatal. Bacterial contamination, toxic compounds, allergic reactions. There are 100 ways that eating random plants can go wrong, and Jefferson seems to have been determined to discover them all. Here's what makes this particularly absurd. Jefferson was brilliant, genuinely remarkably intelligent. He spoke 6 languages, he designed his own house, he founded the University of Virginia. He more or less doubled the size of the United States with the Louisiana Purchase, and yet somehow the thought process that led from, I wonder what this mushroom tastes like, to I should eat it and find out, apparently seemed reasonable to him. The historical irony is almost too perfect. The man who wrote that all men are created equal almost met his end courtesy of questionable salad. The author of Religious Freedom could have been taken out by fungus. The architect of American democracy nearly died because he couldn't leave well enough alone in the produce department. And it's not like people didn't warn him. His staff at Monticello presumably knew which plants were safe. His doctors certainly would have advised against experimental eating. But Jefferson had that specific kind of intellectual confidence that mistakes curiosity for wisdom. He believed he could observe, categorize, and understand nature through rational inquiry. What he failed to account for was that nature doesn't care about your rational inquiry. Nature has poison. Nature will use it. The closest documented call came sometime around 1803 during his first term. Jefferson fell seriously ill after a meal that included foraged greens and wild mushrooms. He was bedridden for nearly a week with what his personal physician described as violent digestive distress and a fever that made them worry about his survival. The symptoms are consistent with muscarine poisoning, a toxin found in certain mushroom species that can cause excessive salivation, sweating, respiratory distress, and, in severe cases, death. Jefferson survived, obviously, but it was close enough that his doctor insisted he stop foraging and stick to cultivated foods, at least for a while. Jefferson agreed, probably while secretly planning his next botanical adventure. Imagine if he hadn't survived. Imagine if the third president of the United States died from salad poisoning in 1803, just 2 years into his presidency, and 1 year before the Lewis and Clark expedition departed. The Louisiana Purchase had just happened. The territory needed to be explored, organized, integrated. The political battles over federal power versus states' rights were intensifying. And Jefferson was the intellectual center of the Democratic Republican movement. His death could have thrown the entire era into chaos, but he lived. He served 2 full terms. He retired to Monticello, where he presumably continued eating questionable plants until his death in 1826. From natural causes, not fungus, which honestly feels like he got away with something. The man who wrote that all men are created equal almost met his end courtesy of questionable salad. And somehow that feels entirely appropriate. And while Jefferson survived his dinner, another president almost didn't survive breakfast, or at least the ride there. Andrew Jackson, the duel that should have killed him, 1806. Let's talk about Andrew Jackson, a man who history remembers as a general, a president, and, let's be honest, kind of a problem. But before he was any of those things, he was a duelist. And not just a casual, we'll meet at dawn and fire into the air duelist. Jackson fought duels the way some people fight wars, personally, violently, and with absolutely no sense of self-preservation. The year was 1806. Jackson was a lawyer and plantation owner in Tennessee, not yet famous, not yet powerful, just another ambitious man with a hair-trigger temper and a reputation to protect. Charles Dickinson was a local celebrity, wealthy, well-connected, and by all accounts an excellent shot, better than Jackson, according to the rumors. The 2 men had been feuding over a horse race bet that went wrong, which spiraled into accusations about Jackson's wife, Rachel, and her questionable marital status. Rachel had technically still been married to her first husband when she married Jackson due to a paperwork error and the slow pace of frontier divorce proceedings. It was innocent, but it was also scandalous, and Dickinson made the mistake of mentioning it publicly. Jackson challenged him to a duel. Dickinson accepted, and on May 30th, 1806, they met in Kentucky because dueling was illegal in Tennessee, so naturally they crossed state lines to attempt murder legally. The rules were simple. They'd stand 24 feet apart. On command, they could fire. Jackson's strategy was unusual. He'd let Dickinson shoot first, on purpose, because Jackson knew Dickinson was the faster draw, the better shot. So instead of trying to beat him on speed, Jackson planned to take the hit, stay standing, and then kill Dickinson while he was reloading or standing there in shock. This is an insane plan. This is a plan that requires you to bet your life on your ability to absorb a bullet and remain conscious long enough to murder someone. But Jackson was nothing if not committed. Dickinson fired first. The bullet hit Jackson square in the chest, shattering 2 ribs and lodging itself less than 2 inches from his heart. Jackson staggered, his coat puffed with dust from the impact. Dickinson, watching from across the field, apparently thought he'd missed, because Jackson was still standing. But Jackson wasn't just standing, he was raising his own pistol. Dickinson, realizing what was about to happen, reportedly stepped backward in horror. The referee had to order him back to his mark. Jackson aimed carefully. His first shot misfired. The hammer stopped at half cock. Under dueling rules, that counted as a shot, and Jackson should have been done. But Jackson, bleeding internally, and probably running on pure spite, pulled the hammer back and fired again. The bullet hit Dickinson in the abdomen. He died hours later. Jackson walked away. Well, walked is generous. He was helped to his horse, bleeding through his coat, coughing blood, and, according to witnesses, looking pale as death. His doctor later determined that the bullet couldn't be removed without killing him, so it stayed there for the rest of his life. Jackson carried Charles Dickinson's bullet in his chest for 39 years, through military campaigns, political battles, and 2 terms as president. Think about that. A piece of lead, 1.5 inches from his heart, lodged between his ribs, slowly poisoning him with lead toxicity for nearly 4 decades. It caused him chronic pain. It probably contributed to his terrible health in old age. And it was entirely, completely, avoidably his own fault. Now, here's the counterfactual that keeps historians awake. What if Dickinson's aim had been just slightly better? What if that bullet had been 2 inches to the right? Jackson dies in Kentucky in 1806, unknown outside of Tennessee, mourned by his wife and maybe a few friends, and that's it. No Battle of New Orleans, no Old Hickory, no presidency, and more importantly, no Trail of Tears, no forced removal of Native American tribes from their ancestral lands, no nullification crisis, no destruction of the Second Bank of the United States. Like him or hate him, and there are very good reasons to do both, Jackson shaped American history in profound and often terrible ways. His presidency was consequential. His policies killed thousands and reshaped the country. All of it depended on Charles Dickinson missing his heart by 2 inches. It's strange how many American lives depended on the bad aim of angry men. Jackson survived because of luck, stubbornness, and presumably some kind of deal with forces we don't fully understand. He went on to become a war hero, a populist icon, and a president who fundamentally changed the office. Whether that was good or bad depends on who you ask and which parts of history you're willing to ignore. But the bullet stayed with him, a permanent reminder that he had won a stupid fight over a horse race and his wife's honor by being willing to die for it, which, depending on your perspective, is either admirably principled or catastrophically dumb. Probably both. It's strange how many American lives depended on the bad aim of angry men. William Henry Harrison, the speech that killed a president, 1841. William Henry Harrison holds a record that will almost certainly never be broken. Shortest presidency in American history, 31 days, 1 month. Not even long enough to get comfortable in the White House or figure out where they keep the good china. And the truly magnificent part, the detail that elevates this from tragedy to cosmic irony, is that he absolutely, definitely killed himself with a speech. March 4th, 1841, Washington, D.C., Inauguration Day. The weather was terrible. Not just regular bad weather, this was the kind of cold, wet, miserable day that makes you want to cancel everything and stay in bed. Freezing rain mixed with snow. Wind strong enough to knock over anyone not actively anchoring themselves. The temperature was hovering around 48 degrees Fahrenheit, which doesn't sound that cold until you add the wind chill and the wet, and then it becomes the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and starts making executive decisions about your immune system. Harrison was 68 years old. At the time, he was the oldest person ever elected president, a record that would stand until Ronald Reagan. He wanted to prove he was vigorous, healthy, fully capable of handling the job. So he decided to deliver his inaugural address outside in the freezing rain without a coat or a hat, or apparently any survival instinct whatsoever. The speech was 8,445 words long. That's not a typo. 8,445 words. It took him nearly 2 hours to deliver. For context, Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address was 272 words. Harrison's speech was longer than some novellas. It covered Roman history, classical republicanism, the proper limits of executive power, and his thoughts on virtually every political issue of the day. It was comprehensive. It was thorough. It was also completely unnecessary, and it killed him. He stood there, hatless and coatless, in freezing rain for 2 hours, reading a speech about how he definitely wasn't going to abuse executive power and would respect congressional authority, which, in retrospect, feels like the universe's way of saying, don't worry, you won't have time to abuse anything. Harrison caught a cold almost immediately. Within days, it developed into pneumonia. His doctors tried everything: bloodletting, medicinal herbs, opium, heated suction cups applied to his skin to draw out the bad humors. Nothing worked, obviously, because none of those things are actual medicine. By late March, Harrison was delirious, drifting in and out of consciousness, occasionally murmuring about government documents and his desire not to be disturbed. He died on April 4th, 1841, exactly 1 month after taking office. Cause of death: pneumonia, almost certainly contracted during his inauguration speech, exacerbated by his age and the aggressive medical treatments that probably finished the job. Now, here's where it gets historically interesting. Harrison's death created a constitutional crisis that nobody had really planned for. The Constitution said that if the president died, the vice president would assume the powers and duties of the office. But did that mean the vice president became president, or just acting president? Was he filling in temporarily or taking over completely? Could he be removed? Did he get a full term or just finish Harrison's? Nobody knew. Vice President John Tyler decided to interpret it aggressively. He took the oath of office, moved into the White House, insisted on being called President Tyler, and basically dared anyone to challenge him. Congress grumbled but went along with it, mostly because the alternative was a constitutional crisis in the middle of economic depression, and nobody had the energy. Tyler's decision set the precedent for presidential succession that we still follow today. The 25th Amendment didn't codify it until 1967, but the basic principle was established in 1841 because Harrison couldn't be bothered to wear a coat. Think about the absurdity of this. The entire concept of presidential succession, the thing that keeps the government functioning when presidents die, resign, or get impeached, was established because an old man gave a very long speech in bad weather. If Harrison had worn a coat, if he'd shortened his speech, if he delivered it indoors like a sensible person, he might have lived years longer. And if he'd lived, someone else would have eventually died in office, and we'd have figured out succession then. But it would have been different. The precedent might have been different. The constitutional interpretation might have gone another way. Instead, we got John Tyler, who wasn't elected president, who nobody particularly wanted as president, and who spent his entire term fighting with Congress because they considered him an accident. Tyler vetoed so many bills that his own party expelled him. He was almost impeached. He was called His Accidency in newspapers, and yet he was president, fully and completely, because Harrison froze to death, proving he was tough enough for the job. A man felled not by bullets, but by bravado and bad weather. It's the kind of death that feels almost designed to make a point about hubris, except the point is so obvious that it feels redundant. Don't stand in freezing rain for 2 hours. Don't prioritize appearances over survival. Don't write inaugural addresses longer than Shakespearean plays, and then deliver them in conditions that would challenge a polar bear. Harrison's death was preventable, pointless, and politically consequential in ways he never could have imagined. He wanted to be remembered as a strong leader, a military hero, a defender of Republican principles. Instead, he's remembered as the president who died because he wouldn't wear a coat. History has a sense of humor. It's just not a very kind one. And speaking of presidential illnesses, the next near death might have saved a war. Abraham Lincoln, the first bullet that missed, August 1864. Abraham Lincoln had a bad habit of not taking security seriously, which is impressive considering he was president during a civil war and received regular death threats. But Lincoln, being Lincoln, tended to wave off concerns with folksy wisdom and a general attitude of, what's the worst that could happen? The worst, as it turned out, nearly happened on a quiet August night in 1864. Lincoln had been spending his summers at the Soldiers' Home, a cottage about 3 miles north of the White House, because Washington, D.C. in summer is approximately the temperature of the sun's surface and smells like a swamp that died of sadness. The commute involved riding his horse, usually alone, despite his guards' protests, along a dark, tree-lined road at night. On the night of August 1864, the exact date is disputed, but likely around the middle of the month, Lincoln was riding back to the Soldiers' Home around 11 at night, alone, in the dark, during a war. Because security protocols apparently hadn't been invented yet, a shot rang out. Lincoln's horse bolted. He nearly fell off, but managed to hang on as the horse galloped toward the Soldiers' Home. When he arrived, he was disheveled, hatless, and remarkably calm about the fact that someone had just tried to kill him. His security guards found his hat on the ground where he'd been shot at. There was a bullet hole through the crown, clean through the tall stovepipe hat Lincoln famously wore. The bullet had passed through the hat, missing his head by inches. Lincoln's response was peak Lincoln. He downplayed it. He suggested the shot might have been accidental, maybe a random hunter or a soldier firing carelessly. His guards were less convinced, possibly because accidental gunfire that perfectly targets the president's hat seems like a stretch even by 19th century standards. They increased security measures, insisted on escorts for his rides, and probably spent several sleepless nights contemplating their career choices. Lincoln, for his part, seemed more annoyed about losing his favorite hat than about nearly dying. He told his guard, "I don't want to worry Mrs. Lincoln about this," which is a very Abraham Lincoln way of saying, let's never speak of this attempted assassination again because my wife has enough problems. Here's what makes this moment historically terrifying. This was August 1864. The Civil War was still raging. Sherman hadn't taken Atlanta yet. Grant was bogged down in the siege of Petersburg. The election was 3 months away, and Lincoln was genuinely worried he'd lose to George McClellan, who was running on a peace platform that would have effectively ended the war without resolving slavery. If Lincoln had died in August 1864, shot by an unknown sniper on a dark road, the Civil War might have ended very differently. Vice President Hannibal Hamlin would have taken over, and while Hamlin was anti-slavery, he wasn't Lincoln. He didn't have Lincoln's political skill, his strategic vision, or his ability to hold together a fractious coalition of Republicans, war Democrats, and abolitionists. The Emancipation Proclamation had been issued, but its enforcement depended entirely on Union victory. A negotiated peace in late 1864 could have preserved slavery in the South, at least temporarily. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery nationwide, wasn't passed until January 1865, and it took all of Lincoln's political maneuvering to make it happen. One bullet, a few inches different, and American history changes completely. Maybe the war ends early with a compromise that leaves the Confederate States semi-autonomous. Maybe slavery persists for decades longer. Maybe the Union fractures permanently. We'll never know because whoever fired that shot, and historians still debate whether it was a deliberate assassination attempt or incredibly careless hunting, missed. Lincoln survived long enough to win re-election, see Sherman take Atlanta, accept Lee's surrender at Appomattox, and push through the 13th Amendment. He survived long enough to imagine what Reconstruction might look like, to talk about binding up the nation's wounds, to plan for peace. He didn't survive long enough to implement any of it, of course. John Wilkes Booth made sure of that in April 1865. But that's the thing about Lincoln's near misses. There were several. Multiple threats, multiple plots, multiple moments when history could have pivoted. The August 1864 shooting was just the one that came closest before Booth succeeded. Lincoln told his guard he was nearly unhorsed by the shot, which is possibly the understatement of the century. Nearly unhorsed is what you say when your stirrup slips, not when someone shoots your hat off your head in the dark. But Lincoln had a gift for minimizing danger, probably because acknowledging how much danger he was actually in would have made it impossible to function. The Civil War almost ended one autumn night, with a single misfired bullet in the dark. Instead, it continued for 8 more months, ended with Union victory and abolition, and fundamentally reshaped the nation. All because someone's aim was off by a few inches. Luck, as always, is a strange thing. It runs out eventually. It ran out for Lincoln in April 1865, when Booth fired at much closer range and didn't miss. But for one night in August 1864, luck held. The bullet passed through the hat and not the head. Lincoln rode home, downplayed the incident, and kept going. The Civil War almost ended one autumn night with a single misfired bullet in the dark. But Lincoln's bad luck wasn't contagious. His successor's was catastrophic. Andrew Johnson, The Assassination That Didn't Happen, April 1865. Andrew Johnson was staying at the Kirkwood House Hotel on the night of April 14th, 1865, which was fortunate for him and unfortunate for pretty much everyone else in American history. He had no idea that upstairs, in room 126, a man named George Atzerodt was supposed to be gathering the courage to murder him. Here's the thing about assassination conspiracies. They only work if everyone involved is equally committed. John Wilkes Booth was committed. Obsessively, dramatically, theatrically committed to killing Lincoln and somehow restoring the Confederacy through violence. He'd recruited a team of co-conspirators, assigned them targets, and planned a coordinated strike that would decapitate the Union leadership in a single night. Booth would kill Lincoln at Ford's Theater. Lewis Powell would kill Secretary of State William Seward at his home, and George Atzerodt would kill Vice President Andrew Johnson at the Kirkwood House. It was a terrible plan for many reasons, but mostly because it depended on George Atzerodt being capable of murder. Atzerodt was a carriage painter from Maryland. He'd helped Booth with an earlier kidnapping plot that never materialized. He was not, by any reasonable definition, an assassin. He was barely a co-conspirator. He was more like a guy who got roped into something way over his head and couldn't figure out how to back out without looking bad. On the night of April 14th, Atzerodt checked into the Kirkwood house and booked a room directly above Johnson's. He had a gun. He had a knife. He had instructions. What he didn't have was any intention of actually going through with it. Instead, he went to a bar. For hours, he drank. He thought about his life choices. He walked around the neighborhood. He came back to the hotel. He stood outside Johnson's door. He left again. He went to another bar. He got progressively drunker and more convinced that this was a bad idea. At some point around 10 o'clock, right around the time Booth was shooting Lincoln and Powell was stabbing Seward's household, Atzerodt decided he was done. He threw his knife into the street, went back to a bar, and proceeded to get monumentally drunk while talking about the assassination plot to anyone who would listen. He was arrested the next day, which means Andrew Johnson, easily one of the worst presidents in American history, survived assassination not because of security or luck, but because his would-be killer had a crisis of conscience lubricated by whiskey. Now let's talk about what would have happened if Atzerodt had succeeded. April 14th, 1865. Lincoln dead, shot at Ford's Theater. Seward badly wounded but alive. Powell's attack failed because Seward was wearing a metal jaw brace from a carriage accident, which deflected the knife strikes. And Johnson, in this hypothetical, also dead, stabbed or shot in his hotel room. The constitutional line of succession in 1865 was thin. After the vice president, it went to, well, there wasn't a clear after. The Presidential Succession Act of 1792 said the president pro tempore of the Senate would be next, followed by the Speaker of the House. In April 1865, that would have been Lafayette S. Foster, a senator from Connecticut that most Americans had never heard of. Imagine the chaos. The Civil War had just ended. Lee surrendered 5 days before Lincoln's assassination. The Confederacy was in ruins. 4 million formerly enslaved people were free, but had no legal protections, no land, no resources. The South was occupied by Union troops, but not yet readmitted to the Union. Constitutional questions about Reconstruction, federal authority, and civil rights were completely unresolved. And into this situation, you'd drop Lafayette Foster, a moderate Republican with no national profile, no Democratic mandate, and absolutely no political capital to spend. He'd be a placeholder president in the middle of the most consequential crisis in American history. Or maybe he wouldn't be president at all. Maybe state governments would have refused to recognize him. Maybe there would have been competing claims to authority. Maybe the military would have stepped in. Maybe the whole fragile structure of post-war America would have collapsed into chaos. We don't know, because it didn't happen. Because George Atzerodt got drunk instead. Here's the bitter irony. Johnson's survival was probably terrible for the country. His presidency was a disaster. He opposed Reconstruction, vetoed civil rights legislation, pardoned Confederate leaders, encouraged Southern states to reimpose white supremacy through black codes, and fought Congress so relentlessly that he became the first president ever impeached. He missed removal from office by 1 vote. His failures during Reconstruction allowed the rise of Jim Crow, the Ku Klux Klan, and a century of legalized segregation and racial terror. Would Foster have been better? We'll never know. Maybe. Probably. It would have been hard to be worse. But the point is that American history, specifically the disastrous course of Reconstruction and the betrayal of emancipation pivoted on one man's inability to commit murder. If Atzerodt had been more like Booth, if he'd managed to overcome his conscience and his fear, Johnson dies. Someone else takes over. The trajectory of race relations, federal power, and constitutional law potentially changes. Instead, Atzerodt got drunk, got caught, got hanged in July 1865 alongside the other conspirators, and left historians to wonder what might have been. History pivoted on one man's hangover, which is either reassuring because it means conscience matters sometimes, or terrifying because it means the arc of history bends toward nothing in particular. It just bends toward wherever random chance and whiskey-soaked decision-making take it. Johnson survived. He became president, he wrecked Reconstruction, and it all happened because George Atzerodt couldn't pull the trigger. History pivoted on one man's hangover. Luck, however, is temporary, especially when you're riding through Buffalo. William McKinley, the handshake that turned deadly, 1901. William McKinley loved people. Genuinely, earnestly loved meeting citizens, shaking hands, making small talk about the weather and the economy. It was part of his political brand. McKinley as the people's president, accessible and warm. A man who never forgot he worked for the American public. Which is lovely, in theory, but becomes a significant security problem when anarchists exist. September 6, 1901, Buffalo, New York. The Pan American Exposition, a World's Fair celebrating technological progress and industrial achievement. McKinley was there for a public reception at the Temple of Music, a concert hall that was absolutely not designed for presidential security. The plan was simple. McKinley would stand in the receiving line and shake hands with anyone who wanted to meet him. No screening, no background checks, just a queue of people and a president with a smile. Leon Czolgosz stood in that line. He was 28 years old, unemployed, radicalized by anarchist literature, and convinced that killing McKinley would strike a blow against capitalist oppression. He was also holding a gun wrapped in a handkerchief, pretending his hand was injured, which is the kind of disguise that should not have worked, but absolutely did, because security in 1901 was essentially try to look for suspicious behavior. McKinley reached out to shake Czolgosz's hand. Czolgosz pulled the trigger. Twice. The first bullet grazed McKinley's ribs. The second buried itself in his abdomen, tearing through his stomach. McKinley staggered backward, caught by guards, and in a moment that defines his entire personality, allegedly said, "Go easy on him, boys," as the crowd swarmed Czolgosz and started beating him. They rushed McKinley to a makeshift hospital on the exposition grounds. The doctor who performed surgery was a gynecologist, not a general surgeon, not a trauma specialist, a gynecologist, because he happened to be the most qualified doctor available at a World's Fair. He operated in a room with inadequate lighting, using a metal pan to reflect sunlight for illumination, like some kind of frontier emergency surgery. They couldn't find the second bullet. They probed around, didn't locate it, and decided to just sew McKinley up and hope for the best. For a few days, it seemed like hope might be enough. McKinley improved. He was eating. He was talking. Doctors issued optimistic statements. Newspapers prepared stories about his miraculous recovery. Vice President Theodore Roosevelt, who'd rushed to Buffalo, left to go hiking in the Adirondack Mountains because the crisis seemed to be over. It wasn't over. On September 13th, McKinley's condition deteriorated rapidly. The wound had become infected, gangrene spreading through his abdomen, poisoning his blood. The missed bullet had perforated his stomach, and the inadequate surgery had failed to repair it properly. McKinley developed septic shock. He died in the early morning of September 14th, 8 days after being shot. Here's the tragedy. McKinley probably could have survived. Not definitely, but probably. Modern medical analysis suggests that with proper surgical technique, antiseptic protocols, and antibiotic treatment, all things that would become standard within a few decades, the gunshot wound was survivable. The bullet missed major arteries. The stomach perforation could have been repaired. The infection could have been prevented or treated, but it was 1901. Antiseptic surgery was still relatively new. Antibiotics wouldn't exist for another 40 years. X-rays had been discovered 6 years earlier, but weren't available at the exposition. The Edison Company had recently developed an X-ray machine and offered to bring it to Buffalo to locate the bullet, but doctors declined, believing it was unnecessary. They just didn't think finding the bullet mattered that much. They were wrong. McKinley died shaking hands with his killer, proof that sometimes manners are overrated. Or more precisely, proof that presidential security in the early 20th century was a catastrophe waiting to happen. McKinley was the third president assassinated in 40 years. Lincoln in 1865, Garfield in 1881, now McKinley in 1901. The Secret Service existed at this point, but wasn't yet responsible for presidential protection. That would change after McKinley's death, but the change came too late for him. Theodore Roosevelt took office immediately. He was 42 years old, the youngest president in American history. He was energetic, ambitious, progressive, and absolutely nothing like McKinley. Roosevelt's presidency transformed American foreign policy, broke up monopolies, created national parks, built the Panama Canal, and generally turned the country into a global power. None of that would have happened under McKinley, who was a cautious conservative focused on tariffs and friendly to big business. One bullet, inadequate surgery, and bacterial infection changed the entire trajectory of the 20th century. McKinley's death brought Roosevelt to power, and Roosevelt brought America into the modern era. Whether that was good or bad depends on your politics and your views on imperialism, but it was undeniably consequential. McKinley died because he loved meeting people and because surgery in 1901 was essentially guesswork with scalpels. He died shaking hands with his killer, and in dying, he made way for a president who would fundamentally reshape the office and the nation. He died shaking hands with his killer, proof that sometimes manners are overrated. And his successor? Well, he got shot too. But that speech in his pocket made all the difference. Theodore Roosevelt. The Bulletproof Speech, 1912. Theodore Roosevelt had already been president. He'd served 2 terms, declined to run for a third, handpicked his successor, William Howard Taft, and then watched in horror as Taft proceeded to undo many of Roosevelt's progressive policies. By 1912, Roosevelt was furious, restless, and convinced that America needed him back. So he decided to run for president again as a third-party candidate for the Progressive Bull Moose Party, because if you're Theodore Roosevelt, why would you do anything in a measured or conventional way? October 14, 1912, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Roosevelt was about to give a campaign speech when a man named John Schrank shot him in the chest from point-blank range. The bullet hit Roosevelt's right chest, penetrating his skin, muscle, and bone. It should have been fatal. It would have been fatal if not for 2 things Roosevelt happened to be carrying in his breast pocket: a steel eyeglass case and a 50-page speech manuscript, folded in half. The bullet struck the eyeglass case first, slowing slightly. Then it tore through the 100 pages of paper. 50 pages folded equals 100 layers, slowing more. By the time it reached Roosevelt's chest, it had lost enough velocity that it didn't penetrate deeply enough to hit his heart or lungs. It lodged in his chest muscle, painful and dangerous, but not immediately fatal. Roosevelt's response was, and I cannot emphasize this enough, insane. He coughed into his hand, saw there was no blood, and concluded his lungs weren't punctured. Then he decided to give his speech anyway. His aides tried to stop him. Doctors tried to stop him. Roosevelt ignored them all, walked on stage, and began by saying, "Friends, I shall ask you to be as quiet as possible. I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot." He pulled out the bullet-riddled speech manuscript, held it up dramatically, and said, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose." Then he delivered the entire 90-minute speech while bleeding internally. 90 minutes. He spoke about social justice, women's suffrage, and the need for progressive reform. He spoke about corporate power and political corruption. He ad-libbed sections because the bullet had destroyed parts of his prepared remarks. He occasionally paused to acknowledge that he was, in fact, shot, and that this was maybe not ideal, but soldiered on anyway because Theodore Roosevelt's relationship with physical danger was somewhere between cavalier and suicidal. When he finally finished, he allowed himself to be taken to the hospital. Doctors examined him, determined the bullet was too risky to remove, too close to vital structures, too deeply lodged, and left it there. Roosevelt carried that bullet in his chest for the rest of his life, 6 more years, until he died in 1919 from a blood clot. Now let's talk about why this matters historically. Roosevelt didn't win the 1912 election. He split the Republican vote, allowing Democrat Woodrow Wilson to win. But Roosevelt's campaign, and specifically his survival of this assassination attempt, cemented his legend. The image of Roosevelt being shot and continuing his speech became iconic. It embodied everything people believed about him: his toughness, his dedication, his absolute refusal to be stopped by anything as trivial as bullets. But here's the darker version. What if the bullet had hit differently? What if there had been no eyeglass case, no speech manuscript? What if Schrank had shot from a different angle, or used a different gun, or fired twice? Roosevelt dies in Milwaukee in October 1912. His Progressive Party collapses without him. It was essentially a cult of personality anyway. The 1912 election becomes a straightforward race between Taft and Wilson. Maybe Taft wins, maybe Wilson still wins, but the progressive movement loses its most charismatic voice at a critical moment. Or here's another scenario. What if Roosevelt had succeeded? What if he'd won the 1912 election? He becomes president again in 1913, serving during World War I instead of Wilson. Roosevelt was an aggressive interventionist. He had pushed for American imperialism in the Caribbean and the Philippines. He almost certainly would have brought America into World War I earlier and more forcefully than Wilson did. The entire course of the war, the peace settlement, the creation of the League of Nations, all of it changes with Roosevelt instead of Wilson. We don't know which version of history would have been better. Maybe Roosevelt's interventionism prevents the rise of fascism. Maybe it makes it worse. Maybe American imperialism accelerates or takes a different form. But the point is that all of it, all of those potential timelines, hinged on whether a bullet could penetrate a speech and an eyeglass case. It couldn't. The bullet was stopped by words and steel. Roosevelt survived, lost the election, and spent his remaining years writing, exploring, and generally refusing to slow down until his body finally gave out in 1919. The story became legend. The bulletproof speech. The bull moose who wouldn't die. It's the kind of story that feels too perfect to be true. Except it is true, verified by witnesses, doctors, and the bullet-riddled manuscript that still exists in museums. Words really did save him. Specifically, 50 pages of words about progressive reform and social justice, dense political rhetoric that absorbed enough kinetic energy to stop a bullet from reaching his heart. There's probably a metaphor there. Something about the power of speech, the strength of conviction, the way ideas can be armor. But mostly, it's just Theodore Roosevelt being Theodore Roosevelt, getting shot in the chest and deciding that finishing his speech was more important than immediate medical attention. Words really did save him. 2 decades later, another would-be assassin took aim and missed again. Franklin D. Roosevelt, the Miami Miss, 1933. Franklin Delano Roosevelt wasn't president yet. That's the detail that makes this attempted assassination particularly consequential. It was February 15th, 1933, 2 weeks before his inauguration. He'd won the election in November 1932, defeating Herbert Hoover in a landslide during the worst economic crisis in American history, but he hadn't taken office yet. He was still president-elect, still planning, still preparing for the enormous task of pulling America out of the Great Depression. He was in Miami for a speech, sitting in an open car in Bayfront Park, surrounded by crowds and local politicians. Among those politicians was Anton Cermak, the mayor of Chicago, who'd come to Miami partly for the warm weather and partly to make nice with the incoming president. Cermak and Roosevelt were chatting in the car, post-speech, relaxed and unguarded. Giuseppe Zangara was standing about 25 feet away, standing on a wobbly chair because he was only 5 feet tall and couldn't see over the crowd. He had a .32 caliber pistol and a plan that was less assassination and more revenge against rich people who caused the Depression, because Zangara's political ideology was somewhat incoherent, but his anger was crystal clear. He fired 5 shots. He missed Roosevelt entirely, partly because he was standing on a chair, partly because a woman named Lillian Cross saw him raise the gun and grabbed his arm, partly because Zangara was a terrible shot under ideal conditions, and these were not ideal conditions. But the bullets had to go somewhere. One hit Anton Cermak in the chest. 4 others hit bystanders, a woman from New Jersey, a man from New York, and 2 other people whose names would become footnotes in history books. Cermak was rushed to the hospital. He lingered for 3 weeks before dying of his wounds, reportedly telling Roosevelt, "I'm glad it was me instead of you," which is either incredibly selfless or the kind of thing you say when you're dying and trying to sound noble. Roosevelt, meanwhile, was untouched, physically untouched, but he'd just watched a man get shot trying to kill him. He'd heard the screams, seen the panic, watched people bleed. His response was to order his driver to take him to the hospital so he could sit with the wounded, comfort them, and project calm leadership in the middle of chaos. That response, Roosevelt's composure under fire, became part of his mythology. Here was a man who'd already survived polio, who couldn't walk without assistance, who had rebuilt his political career from a wheelchair, and now he'd survived an assassination attempt without flinching. It reinforced the image of Roosevelt as unbreakable, destined, chosen by history. But here's the terrifying counterfactual. What if Zangara's aim had been better? What if Lillian Cross hadn't grabbed his arm? What if one of those bullets had hit Roosevelt instead of Cermak? February 1933. The Great Depression had been grinding on for 3 years. Banks were failing. Unemployment was at 25%. People were starving. Hoover's administration had been paralyzed, ideologically opposed to direct government intervention. Roosevelt had just won promising a New Deal, aggressive federal action to stabilize the economy, reform the banking system, create jobs, and restore confidence. If Roosevelt dies in Miami, none of that happens. The presidency goes to Vice President-elect John Nance Garner, a Texas congressman who was conservative, skeptical of federal power, and absolutely not the visionary leader the moment required. Maybe Garner tries some version of the New Deal. Maybe he doesn't. Maybe the Depression deepens. Maybe the American political system fractures under the strain. Maybe far-right or far-left movements gain traction. Maybe democracy itself becomes a casualty. and that's just domestic policy. Now consider World War II. Roosevelt's foreign policy evolved from isolationism to interventionism as the 1930s progressed. He pushed Lend-Lease to support Britain, maneuvered around neutrality laws, and positioned America to eventually enter the war against Germany and Japan. Without Roosevelt, does America stay neutral longer? Does Britain fall without American support? Does Hitler win in Europe? These aren't idle speculations. Historians genuinely debate how much individual leaders matter versus structural forces, but Roosevelt is one of the clearest cases where the individual mattered enormously. His political skill, his communication ability, his vision for an activist federal government, these shaped the 20th century in profound ways. All of it depended on Giuseppe Zangara being a bad shot. Zangara was executed in March 1933, claiming he had no regrets and would have killed any president, not just Roosevelt specifically. He was bitter, in chronic pain from stomach issues, and convinced that all rich people were responsible for his suffering. He wasn't part of a conspiracy. He wasn't politically sophisticated. He was just angry and happened to have a gun. And because his aim was off by a few feet, because a woman in the crowd grabbed his arm, because Roosevelt was sitting at just the right angle, American history continued on a path that led to the New Deal, World War II victory, and the creation of the modern American state. America's future dodged a bullet, literally. And then it went on to fight a world war, create Social Security, build the interstate highway system, and establish America as a superpower. All because one man with a gun couldn't hit his target from 25 feet away. America's future dodged a bullet, literally. And speaking of bullets, Truman's luck would be tested at his own front door. Harry S. Truman, the Blair House Shootout, 1950. Harry Truman was taking a nap. This is important because it means he was upstairs, in his underwear, when two men tried to shoot their way into his temporary residence to kill him. Which is honestly not the worst way to survive an assassination attempt. Being asleep and defenseless tends to keep you out of the line of fire. November 1st, 1950. Blair House, across the street from the White House. Truman was living there because the White House was falling apart, literally, structurally unsound, with floors that sagged and ceilings that cracked. Renovation would take years, so the President of the United States, the man with his finger on the nuclear button during the Korean War, was napping in a townhouse guarded by a handful of Secret Service agents and DC police. Griselio Torresola and Oscar Collazo were Puerto Rican nationalists who wanted independence for Puerto Rico and believed that killing Truman would somehow accomplish this. Their plan was straightforward: walk up to Blair House and shoot everyone in the way until they reached the president. It was not a sophisticated plan. It was barely a plan at all. They approached from opposite directions, guns drawn. The shooting started at 2:20 p.m. and lasted about 3 minutes, which doesn't sound like very long until you remember that 3 minutes of active gunfire in downtown Washington is an eternity. Officer Leslie Cauffault was standing guard at the west booth. Torresola shot him 3 times in the chest and abdomen. Cauffault, mortally wounded and dying, steadied himself against the booth, aimed carefully, and shot Torresola in the head, killing him instantly. Then Cauffault collapsed. He died 4 hours later. He's the reason this story doesn't end with, and then they killed the president. Meanwhile, Collazo was trying to shoot his way through the front entrance. He wounded 2 other officers before being shot himself, hit in the chest by Officer Donald Birdsell, who'd been shot in the knee but kept firing anyway because apparently everyone involved in this gunfight had absurd pain tolerance. Upstairs, Truman heard the shots. He went to the window, because of course he did, because presidents in the 1950s had no sense of self-preservation, and looked out at the gunfight happening 30 feet below him. A Secret Service agent saw him and screamed at him to get back inside. Truman, to his credit, listened. The whole thing was over in 3 minutes. One officer dead, one attacker dead, one attacker wounded and arrested. Truman unharmed, if slightly annoyed that his nap had been interrupted by amateur revolutionaries with terrible tactical planning. Here's what makes this consequential. Truman was dealing with Korea. American troops were fighting Chinese and North Korean forces in a grinding, brutal war that threatened to escalate into World War III. General MacArthur wanted to use nuclear weapons. Truman was resisting, trying to contain the conflict, walking a diplomatic tightrope between appearing weak and starting nuclear Armageddon. If Truman dies in November 1950, Vice President Alben Barkley takes over. Barkley was 72 years old, a career politician with no foreign policy experience and no vision for how to end the Korean War. Maybe he gives MacArthur more authority. Maybe MacArthur uses nukes. Maybe China retaliates. Maybe the Cold War goes hot in 1950 instead of staying cold for 40 years. Or maybe nothing changes. Maybe Barkley follows Truman's policies. Maybe history continues basically the same. But the point is, we don't know. And we don't know because Oscar Collazo couldn't shoot straight, and Leslie Koffelt, bleeding to death, could. Koffelt is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. There's a plaque at Blair House honoring his sacrifice. Collazo served 29 years in prison before being pardoned by Jimmy Carter in 1979. Truman went back to his nap, or tried to, and presumably spent the rest of the afternoon reflecting on how his life had been saved by a policeman he'd probably never met. He woke to gunfire and history knocking politely on his door. Koffelt answered it, and because he did, Truman lived to finish the Korean War, fire MacArthur, and leave office in 1953 with approval ratings in the basement, but his legacy intact. The next close call didn't involve bullets, just bad weather and worse judgment. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the heart that couldn't quit, 1955. Dwight Eisenhower was playing golf in Denver on September 23, 1955, because that's what presidents did in the 1950s when they weren't threatening to nuke people or building highways. He'd finished 9 holes when he started feeling off. Indigestion, maybe, or something he ate. He blamed it on onions, because when you're 64 years old and experiencing chest pains, the natural assumption is definitely onions, and not, say, a massive coronary infarction. He finished his round anyway, 18 holes, with a heart attack in progress. Then he went home, ate dinner, and went to bed, still convinced it was the onions. By 2:30 a.m., the pain was bad enough that he woke his wife, Mamie, who called the doctor. The doctor took one look at Eisenhower and knew. Heart attack. Serious one. The kind that kills people. They rushed him to Fitzsimons Army Hospital. The press was told the president had suffered digestive upset, which is technically true if you consider your heart is dying, a form of digestive upset. For 24 hours, the American public had no idea their president was fighting for his life. When the truth came out, the stock market crashed. Literally. The Dow Jones dropped 6.5% in a single day. The worst decline since 1929. Because this was 1955, and Eisenhower wasn't just the president. He was the steady hand on the nuclear trigger during the Cold War. He was the former Supreme Allied commander who had defeated Hitler. He was the reassuring father figure who had led America through the early years of suburban prosperity and Cold War anxiety. And he was currently unconscious in a hospital bed with doctors unsure if he'd survive the week. If Eisenhower dies in September 1955, Richard Nixon becomes president. Nixon was 42 years old, ambitious, paranoid, and 7 years away from the version of himself who'd win the presidency legitimately. This Nixon was unformed, untested as a leader, known mostly for his aggressive anti-communism and his role in the Alger Hiss case. He'd never run anything larger than a Senate office. The Cold War was at a critical moment. The Soviet Union had nuclear weapons. Eastern Europe was under communist control. The arms race was accelerating. Eisenhower's foreign policy was built on massive retaliation. the threat of overwhelming nuclear response to Soviet aggression, but also on restraint, on not actually using those weapons. Eisenhower understood war. He'd seen its costs firsthand. He knew that nuclear war meant the end of civilization. Would Nixon have shown the same restraint? We'll never know, because Eisenhower survived. He spent 7 weeks in the hospital, recovering slowly, learning to walk again, following a strict diet and exercise regimen. His doctors told him he should retire. Eisenhower ignored them and ran for re-election in 1956, winning in a landslide because America apparently decided that a president with a bad heart was better than the uncertainty of someone new. He served his full second term, suffered another heart attack in 1965, and died in 1969 after multiple cardiac episodes. But in 1955, on that golf course in Denver, his heart could have quit entirely. The muscle could have given out. The damage could have been irreparable. In American history, Cold War diplomacy, civil rights progress, the entire trajectory of the 1950s would have pivoted on whether Eisenhower's cardiologist was good enough and whether his heart was strong enough. Turns out the nuclear age could have ended over 18 holes. Not with missiles or bombs, but with cholesterol and chest pain and a president who thought he was just experiencing indigestion. Eisenhower's survival was medical, yes, but it was also luck. The luck of having access to the best cardiac care available in 1955, the luck of a strong constitution built from decades of military discipline, the luck of a heart that decided, against the odds, to keep beating. He lived another 14 years. Nixon eventually got his presidency, but in 1968, not 1955. By then, Nixon was different, more experienced, more calculated, more damaged by loss and defeat. The Nixon who would have taken over in 1955 versus the Nixon who won in 1968 were two different men, shaped by different experiences. But Eisenhower's heart held, and so the world, teetering on the edge of nuclear catastrophe, continued under steady leadership for a few more years. Turns out the nuclear age could have ended over 18 holes. But if Eisenhower's heart was weak, Kennedy's luck was weaker still. John F. Kennedy, the pre-Dallas attempt, 1960. Everyone knows about Dallas. November 22nd, 1963. Dealey Plaza, the motorcade, the ending that changed everything. But almost nobody remembers December 11th, 1960, when a 73-year-old retired postal worker named Richard Pavlik almost killed President-elect Kennedy in Palm Beach, Florida. Pavlik was angry. He'd voted for Kennedy, but then convinced himself that Kennedy was a traitor bought by his wealthy father, Joseph Kennedy. His logic was incoherent and conspiratorial, but his planning was meticulous. He'd been following Kennedy for weeks, studying his movements, his schedule, his routines. He'd bought dynamite, 7 sticks of it, which is approximately 7 more sticks than most retirement hobbies require. He wired the dynamite to his car, ready to blow himself up in a suicide bombing that would take Kennedy with him. The plan was simple. Wait for Kennedy to leave his Palm Beach home for Sunday Mass, then drive into Kennedy's car and detonate the explosives. A car bomb. In 1960, in Florida, 3 years before anyone had seriously considered that presidential security might need to account for suicide bombers. December 11th, 1960. Pavlik sat in his explosives-filled car, watching the Kennedy house. Kennedy emerged, ready to leave for church. Pavlik prepared to drive forward, to end both their lives in fire and shrapnel and national trauma. Then he saw Jackie Kennedy and the children. They were with JFK saying goodbye, smiling and waving. And Pavlik, for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, decided he couldn't do it. Not in front of the wife and kids. Not like that. It wasn't mercy, exactly. More like a delayed sense of decency. He drove away. He didn't abandon the plan, he just postponed it. For days, he followed Kennedy, waiting for a moment when Kennedy would be alone, when collateral damage could be avoided, when murder could be conducted with some kind of twisted moral logic. But Pavlik's behavior had attracted attention. He'd been writing angry letters. He'd been asking suspicious questions. Local police and Secret Service started investigating. On December 15th, they arrested him in his car, which was still wired with explosives and parked near Kennedy's home. Pavlik was declared mentally unfit to stand trial and spent the next 6 years in psychiatric facilities before being released in 1966. He lived until 1975, dying quietly, largely forgotten by history. But think about the alternate timeline. Kennedy dies in December 1960, before taking office. He's killed not by a lone gunman in Dallas, but by a suicide bomber in Palm Beach. Vice President-elect Lyndon Johnson becomes president, but it's a different Johnson than the one who took over in 1963. This Johnson hasn't been shaped by Kennedy's vision, hasn't learned Kennedy's style, hasn't built relationships with Kennedy's team. He's just a Texas politician thrust into power by tragedy before the administration even begins. The 1960s look completely different. Maybe Johnson pushes civil rights harder, earlier. Maybe he escalates Vietnam faster, without Kennedy's gradual involvement. Maybe the Cuban Missile Crisis never happens because Johnson handles Cuba differently. Maybe the space race proceeds differently. Maybe. History gave Kennedy a preview, and he still showed up for the sequel. Pavlik's failed attempt was forgotten almost immediately, overshadowed by Kennedy's successful inauguration, his 1,000 days in office, and finally, his death in Dallas. But for one morning in December 1960, history pivoted on whether a 73-year-old man with dynamite and delusions could bring himself to murder in front of children. He couldn't. So, Kennedy lived 3 more years. He faced the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Berlin Wall, the beginnings of Vietnam. He launched the Peace Corps, pushed for civil rights legislation, and inspired a generation with rhetoric about new frontiers and asking what you can do for your country. And then, in Dallas, someone else succeeded where Pavlik had failed. Different method, different motive, different outcome, but the same ending. History gave him a preview, and he still showed up for the sequel, which makes you wonder if fate is real, or if Kennedy just had terrible luck that eventually ran out. Either way, December 1960 was the assassination attempt that almost nobody remembers, the near miss that changed nothing because it failed. And after Kennedy, the threats just kept coming. Gerald Ford, twice in 17 days. 1975, Gerald Ford holds a record that nobody wants. Most assassination attempts survived in the shortest period of time. 2 attempts, 17 days. Both in California, both by women, both complete failures, but not for lack of trying. September 5th, 1975, Sacramento. Ford was walking through Capitol Park to meet with Governor Jerry Brown. Lynette Squeaky Fromm, a follower of Charles Manson, wearing a bright red robe because subtlety was not her strength, pushed through the crowd and pointed a Colt .45 pistol at Ford from 2 feet away. She pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. The gun had 4 rounds in the magazine, but none in the chamber. Secret Service agent Larry Buendorf grabbed the gun and tackled Fromm before she could chamber a round. Ford, who'd apparently inherited some kind of assassination survival gene, remained calm and continued walking as if this was just a regular Tuesday. Fromm later said she'd deliberately left the chamber empty, that she had wanted to make a statement about environmental destruction and the redwood forests, not actually kill Ford. Prosecutors were unimpressed by this defense. She was convicted of attempted assassination and served 34 years in prison. 17 days later, September 22, 1975, Ford was in San Francisco. He'd just given a speech and was leaving the St. Francis Hotel. Sarah Jane Moore, a 45-year-old accountant and FBI informant who'd become radicalized and was now trying to prove her revolutionary credentials, stood in the crowd about 40 feet away with a .38 caliber revolver. She fired. The bullet missed Ford's head by about 5 inches, close enough that Ford later said he heard it pass. A bystander named Oliver Sipple, a former Marine, saw Moore raise the gun and grabbed her arm just as she fired, deflecting the shot. Moore got off a second shot that hit a nearby wall. Secret Service agents tackled her. Ford was rushed to his limousine, unharmed again, probably wondering what he'd done to anger the universe. Moore was convicted and served 32 years in federal prison. Sipple became briefly famous, then had his privacy destroyed when the media outed him as gay against his wishes, and he spent the rest of his life battling depression and alcoholism. He died in 1989, largely forgotten except as a footnote in presidential assassination history. So let's talk about Ford's unique situation. He was never elected president or vice president. He was appointed VP after Spiro Agnew resigned, then became president when Nixon resigned. He was the accidental president, thrust into office by scandal and constitutional process. Nobody had voted for him. His legitimacy was entirely procedural. If either assassination attempt had succeeded, if Fromm had chambered around, if Moore's aim had been better, Vice President Nelson Rockefeller becomes president. Rockefeller was a moderate Republican, former governor of New York, from one of America's wealthiest families. His presidency would have been vastly different from Ford's. More liberal, more interventionist, more willing to challenge conservative Republicans. The 1976 election changes completely. Maybe Rockefeller runs as the incumbent. Maybe Ronald Reagan challenges him in the primary and wins. Maybe Jimmy Carter still wins, maybe he doesn't. The entire trajectory of late 1970s politics pivots on whether two women with guns can hit a target from close range. They couldn't. Ford survived both attempts and went on to lose the 1976 election to Carter, primarily because he'd pardoned Nixon and the economy was struggling. He lived until 2006, dying at 93, the longest-lived president in history at the time. But for 17 days in September 1975, Ford's survival was a matter of luck, alert bystanders, and incompetent would-be assassins. When you survive 2 assassination attempts before your next haircut, you start to wonder if the Secret Service deserves a raise, or if maybe California just has something against Republican presidents, or if the universe was running some kind of experiment to see how many times one person could almost die without actually dying. Ford passed the test, twice, in under 3 weeks, which is either remarkably lucky or evidence that fate really wanted him to finish his term and lose to Carter, just so history could proceed exactly as it did. When you survive 2 assassination attempts before your next haircut, you start to wonder if the Secret Service deserves a raise, and Ford's successor faced his own brush with chaos, this time from the air. Jimmy Carter, the Killer Rabbit Incident, 1979. Let's be clear, a rabbit did not almost kill Jimmy Carter. Rabbits, despite their surprising teeth and occasionally aggressive territorial behavior, are not capable of presidential assassination. But what happened in April 1979 on a pond in Georgia was, in its own way, a near-death experience. Not of the physical kind, but of the political kind. Sometimes reputations die before presidents do. Carter was fishing, alone, in a small boat, in a pond near his hometown of Plains, Georgia. It was supposed to be relaxing, a break from the pressures of the presidency, the Iran hostage crisis brewing, inflation rising, energy shortages, Soviet aggression, everything going wrong simultaneously. Just a man in a pond and the hope of catching something edible. Then the rabbit appeared. It was swimming toward his boat, aggressively, with what Carter later described as its teeth visible. which is not a phrase you want to hear about any animal approaching you in water. Rabbits are not supposed to swim. They're not aquatic mammals. But this particular swamp rabbit, yes, that's a real species, Silvolegus aquaticus, native to the southeastern United States, had apparently decided that Carter's boat was either a threat or a destination. Carter used his paddle to splash water at the rabbit, trying to deter it from boarding the boat. The rabbit, showing either courage or madness, kept swimming. Carter kept splashing. Eventually, the rabbit gave up and swam away, leaving Carter unharmed, confused, and in possession of a story that absolutely nobody would believe, which is why he probably shouldn't have told anyone, but he did. He told his staff. His staff thought it was funny. Someone mentioned it to a reporter, and in August 1979, the story broke. President attacked by rabbit. The Washington Post ran it. The headline was Bunny Goes Bugs, Rabbit Attacks President. The press had a field day. Political cartoonists drew Carter as a coward fleeing from a tiny rabbit. Late-night comedians made jokes. The incident became a symbol of Carter's struggling presidency. If he couldn't even handle a rabbit, how could he handle the Soviets? The White House released a photograph showing the rabbit swimming toward Carter's boat, which only made things worse because it confirmed the story was real, while also making Carter look ridiculous for needing photographic evidence to defend himself against accusations of rabbit cowardice. This is where it becomes a near-death experience. Carter's presidency was already struggling. Inflation was at 13%, gas prices were soaring, American hostages were being held in Iran, and every rescue attempt either failed or never launched. Carter's approval ratings were dismal. He needed to project strength, competence, control. Instead, he got killer rabbit. The incident became shorthand for everything wrong with Carter's presidency. Passive, ineffectual, unable to command respect even from wildlife. It was unfair. Carter was actually quite competent in many ways, and the economic problems he faced were largely beyond his control. But perception matters in politics, and the perception was that Jimmy Carter was the kind of president who got terrorized by rabbits. November 1980. Ronald Reagan demolished Carter in the presidential election. The killer rabbit incident wasn't the reason. The hostage crisis, the economy, and Carter's general image of weakness were the main factors. But the rabbit story contributed to that image. It was one more data point in the narrative that Carter couldn't handle the job. So did the rabbit almost kill Carter? No, but it helped kill his presidency, which, in political terms, is almost the same thing. Sometimes the threats that end your career aren't bullets or bombs. Sometimes they're just small, wet animals with surprisingly aggressive swimming behavior and terrible timing. Carter survived the rabbit, he served out his term, he lost re-election, and then he spent the next 4 decades becoming arguably the best ex-president in American history, building houses, monitoring elections, mediating conflicts, winning the Nobel Peace Prize. His post-presidency redeemed his presidency in ways that the rabbit never could have predicted. But in April 1979, on a pond in Georgia, Carter faced an enemy that wounded him more than any assassin's bullet: ridicule. And unlike bullets, ridicule doesn't miss. It hits its target every time, and the damage lasts longer than any wound. Sometimes reputations die before presidents do, and sometimes the thing that kills them is a rabbit, and the next man would face a much louder threat. Ronald Reagan, the Hinckley shooting, 1981. Ronald Reagan was 70 days into his presidency when John Hinckley Jr. decided to impress Jodie Foster by murdering the leader of the free world. This is not a logical plan, but Hinckley was not operating from logic. He was obsessed with the film Taxi Driver, identified with Travis Bickle's attempted political assassination, and convinced that killing Reagan would make Foster fall in love with him. Hinckley's relationship with reality was, at best, strained. March 30th, 1981. Washington Hilton Hotel. Reagan had just finished giving a speech to AFL-CIO representatives. He was walking to his limousine, waving at the crowd, smiling for cameras, doing the normal presidential thing. Hinckley stood in the press area, about 15 feet away, with a .22 caliber revolver. He fired 6 shots in less than 2 seconds. First shot hit Press Secretary James Brady in the head, causing permanent brain damage. Second shot hit D.C. police officer Thomas Delahanty in the neck. Third shot went over Reagan's head. Fourth shot hit Secret Service agent Timothy McCarthy in the abdomen. Fifth shot hit the bulletproof window of the limousine. Sixth shot ricocheted off the limousine's armored side, hit the gap between the open door and the car body, flattened into a disc, and entered Reagan's chest under his left arm. Reagan didn't know he'd been shot. Nobody knew he'd been shot. Secret Service agent Jerry Parr shoved him into the limousine and ordered the driver to head for the White House. Reagan felt pain in his chest, thought he'd broken a rib when Parr pushed him down. He coughed. Blood came up. Bright red, frothy, arterial blood. Parr immediately redirected to George Washington University Hospital, about 2 minutes away. Reagan walked into the emergency room under his own power because that's what 70-year-old men who've been shot do when they're Ronald Reagan. He made it about 10 feet inside before collapsing. The bullet had entered under his left arm, punctured his lung, and stopped less than an inch from his heart. If the shot had been from a different angle, if the door had been closed, if the bullet hadn't ricocheted and flattened first, it would have hit the aorta, and Reagan would have bled out in the limousine before reaching the hospital. He lost over half his blood. His blood pressure dropped to almost nothing. Doctors performed emergency surgery, cracking his chest to locate the flattened bullet and repair the damage to his lung. Reagan, because he was Reagan, stayed conscious long enough to joke with the medical staff. "I hope you're all Republicans," he told the surgeons. One replied, "Today, Mr. President, we're all Republicans." He survived. Obviously. But it was close. Closer than the public understood at the time. The initial reports suggested Reagan was fine, just a minor wound. The truth was that he nearly died on the operating table. His age, the blood loss, the trauma, any one of those factors could have killed him. If Reagan dies in March 1981, George H.W. Bush becomes president. Bush was vice president, former CIA director, and experienced in foreign policy, but hadn't yet defined his own political identity. He'd been Reagan's rival in the 1980 primary before becoming his running mate. Would Bush have continued Reagan's conservative revolution, or would he have reverted to his more moderate instincts? The 1980s change completely. Maybe the Soviet Union isn't challenged as aggressively. Maybe the Cold War thaws differently. Maybe the economic policies, Reaganomics, supply-side tax cuts, deregulation, proceed differently under Bush. Or maybe everything happens roughly the same, just with a different face and a different style. We don't know because Reagan survived. He recovered, returned to work, served 2 full terms, and fundamentally reshaped American politics in ways we're still dealing with. The attempted assassination boosted his popularity. The image of Reagan joking from his hospital bed, projecting strength and humor in the face of death, became iconic. His approval ratings soared. His political capital increased. The shooting, paradoxically, strengthened his presidency. John Hinckley Jr. was found not guilty by reason of insanity and spent 35 years in psychiatric facilities before being released in 2016. James Brady, the press secretary who was shot in the head, survived but suffered permanent disabilities. He became a gun control advocate, and the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act was named in his honor. Timothy McCarthy and Thomas Delahanty recovered from their injuries. Reagan carried the flattened bullet with him for the rest of his life. Not literally, obviously, they removed it during surgery, But the memory of it, the closeness of death, the way history had pivoted on a ricochet and a few inches of trajectory. The Gipper survived on timing, steel, and punchlines. And because he did, the 1980s became the Reagan era, for better or worse, with all the conservative revolution and Cold War brinksmanship and economic transformation that entailed. The Gipper survived on timing, steel, and punchlines, and while Reagan was saved by luck, George H.W. Bush was saved by altitude. George H.W. Bush, the Skymaster Incident, 1944. Before George H.W. Bush was president, before he was vice president, before he was CIA director or congressman or ambassador, he was a 20-year-old Navy pilot flying torpedo bombers in the Pacific during World War II. And on September 2nd, 1944, he almost became a footnote, another name on a memorial wall, another casualty of a war that consumed millions. Bush was flying a TBM Avenger call sign Barbara, named after his girlfriend and future wife, on a mission to bomb radio installations on the island of Chichijima. It was his 58th combat mission. He'd already been shot down once and rescued. He was young, brave, and statistically overdue for bad luck. The mission went wrong almost immediately. Japanese anti-aircraft fire hit Bush's plane, setting the engine on fire. Black smoke poured into the cockpit. The plane was losing altitude, spiraling toward the ocean or the island. Neither option particularly appealing since Chichijima was occupied by Japanese forces known for executing captured airmen. Bush stayed in the plane long enough to complete the bombing run, hit the target, released the payload, then gave the order to bail out. He and his two crewmen, radioman John Delaney and gunner William White, prepared to jump. Bush bailed first. His parachute opened. He hit the water hard, injured his head, and surfaced disoriented and bleeding. He inflated his life raft and scanned the sky for his crewmen's parachutes. They never appeared. Delaney and White went down with the plane. Historians still debate what happened, whether their parachutes failed, whether they were killed by the initial anti-aircraft hit, whether they bailed too late. Bush never knew. He spent the rest of his life carrying the guilt of survival, wondering if he'd ordered them to bail too late, if he could have done something differently. But that's not the close call. The close call is what came next. Bush was floating in the Pacific, bleeding, about 4 miles off Chichijima. Japanese boats began moving toward him. If they reached him first, he'd be captured, interrogated, and almost certainly executed. This wasn't speculation. After the war, it was discovered that the Japanese garrison on Chichijima had executed 9 captured American airmen. Some were beheaded, some were tortured. And in at least one confirmed case, executed prisoners were cannibalized by Japanese officers. Bush's crewmates, who went down with other planes in his squadron, faced this fate. They were captured, executed, and in some documented cases, their remains were desecrated. Bush was minutes away from the same outcome. Then the USS Finback, an American submarine, surfaced. The sub had been stationed in the area specifically to rescue downed pilots. They'd seen Bush's plane go down, tracked his position, and made it to him just ahead of the Japanese boats. Sailors pulled Bush aboard. The sub dove. Bush was safe. If the Finback had been 5 minutes slower, or if Bush had bailed out closer to the island, or if the Japanese boats had been faster, he's captured, executed. The Bush family ends there. No George W. Bush presidency, no Jeb Bush governorship, no political dynasty. The entire trajectory of late 20th century American conservatism changes because one submarine was in the right place at the right time. Bush served the rest of the war, came home, married Barbara, went to Yale, moved to Texas, got into oil, and then politics. He became congressman, ambassador to the UN, CIA director, vice president, and finally president in 1989. His presidency included the end of the Cold War, the Gulf War, and the beginning of American unipolarity. His son's presidency included 9/11, Afghanistan, Iraq, and a reshaping of American foreign policy that we're still living with, all of it dependent on a submarine surfacing in time. Bush rarely talked about Chichijima publicly. The memory haunted him. The lost crewmen, the closeness of death, the randomness of survival. But privately, it shaped his worldview. He understood mortality, understood that life was fragile and luck was temporary. It made him cautious, pragmatic, careful in ways that his son wouldn't be. A single parachute created a presidency and a future one. And the only reason that parachute mattered was because a submarine crew did their job well, and the Pacific Ocean, vast and indifferent, happened to put Bush within swimming distance of rescue instead of execution. A single parachute created a presidency and a future one. But even when peace came, danger didn't stop. Bill Clinton, the White House airstrike, 1994. Bill Clinton was not home on September 12, 1994, when a suicidal Maryland man named Frank Eugene Corder stole a single-engine Cessna 150 and crashed it into the White House. This matters because the plane hit almost exactly below Clinton's bedroom window on the second floor. If Clinton had been sleeping there, which he would have been on most nights, the outcome could have been very different. It was 1:49 a.m. Corder, drunk and depressed about his failing marriage and financial problems, had stolen the Cessna from Aldino Airport in Maryland. He flew south toward Washington, D.C., navigating by following landmarks and probably operating on autopilot, muscle memory, and whatever coherent thoughts alcohol and despair allowed. He approached the White House from the south, flying low enough that the small plane wasn't immediately detected by radar as a threat. The White House's air defenses in 1994 were designed for missiles and military aircraft, not a tiny stolen plane flown by a suicidal man at 2 a.m. Corder aimed for the south lawn. He hit a magnolia tree first, the famous Andrew Jackson magnolia, which deflected the plane slightly. The Cessna crashed into the wall just below the second-floor residential quarters, directly under the president's bedroom. The plane crumpled. Corder died instantly. The impact left a hole in the wall and scattered debris across the lawn. Clinton was at the Blair house that night, again because the White House was undergoing renovations, the same Blair house where Truman had survived an assassination attempt in 1950. Apparently, whenever the White House needs work done, presidents get sent to Blair House and people try to kill them. It's a pattern. Secret Service responded immediately, initially fearing a terrorist attack. They found Corder's body in the wreckage, realized it was a lone individual rather than a coordinated assault, and began investigating. Corder had no political motives, no connections to extremist groups. He was just a depressed man who stole a plane and crashed it into the White House because, actually, his motives were never entirely clear. Suicide seems likely. A final dramatic gesture. Or maybe he just wanted to hit something significant before dying. The implications were terrifying. If a drunk, depressed man could steal a plane and crash it into the White House, what could a motivated terrorist do? The incident exposed massive gaps in White House security. Airports near D.C. were supposed to have restrictions. Small aircraft were supposed to be tracked. The idea that someone could just fly into the White House undetected was, quite frankly, embarrassing. Security was tightened after the incident. No-fly zones were expanded. Radar coverage improved. Surface-to-air missile defenses were reportedly upgraded, though details remain classified. The Secret Service presumably spent several sleepless nights imagining worse scenarios. Larger planes, actual explosives, coordinated attacks, which makes September 11, 2001, 7 years later. Even more chilling in retrospect, the 1994 Cessna crash was a preview, a warning that aircraft could be used as weapons against government targets. The warning was noted but not fully heeded. Improvements were made to White House security specifically, but the broader vulnerability, commercial aircraft used as guided missiles, wasn't addressed until after 9/11 made the threat undeniable. Clinton's life was spared by scheduling, and maybe the pilot's bad aim. If Clinton had been in his bedroom, would the crash have killed him? Maybe not. The Cessna was small, carried no explosives, and the White House is built like a fortress. But maybe yes. The impact occurred directly below where he slept. Debris, fire, structural collapse. Any number of factors could have turned a near miss into a tragedy. Clinton served 2 full terms, survived impeachment, presided over the longest peacetime economic expansion in American history, and left office with high approval ratings despite scandals. But on one night in September 1994, his survival depended on being in the wrong place, or rather, the right place, because Blair House was definitely the correct location when stolen planes started hitting the White House. Frank Corder's death changed security protocols but didn't change history. Clinton lived. The presidency continued, and the vulnerability of symbolic targets to aerial attack was noted, filed away, and partially forgotten until terrorists with better planning and larger planes proved the concept on a much more devastating scale. Clinton's life was spared by scheduling, and maybe the pilot's bad aim. And that wasn't the last aircraft to change history. George W. Bush, 9/11, morning delay, 2001. George W. Bush was reading The Pet Goat to second graders at Emma E. Booker Elementary School in Sarasota, Florida, on the morning of September 11th, 2001, when Andrew Card whispered in his ear, "A second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack." Bush continued reading for approximately 7 minutes, a decision that would be endlessly analyzed, criticized, and defended. But what matters for this story isn't what Bush did in that classroom. It's what he didn't experience while he was there, namely being targeted for assassination. The 9/11 attacks involved 4 hijacked planes. 2 hit the World Trade Center. 1 hit the Pentagon. The 4th, United Flight 93, crashed in Pennsylvania after passengers fought back. The hijacker's original target for that 4th plane remains debated, likely either the Capitol or the White House, but there were rumors, unconfirmed and probably inaccurate, that Air Force One might have been a target. Whether true or not, Bush's location that morning may have provided accidental protection. He was in Florida, at an elementary school, on a publicly scheduled visit. If terrorists had wanted to target him specifically, they would have known where he was. But they didn't. Their targets were symbolic buildings, not the mobile president. Once the attacks began, Bush's security became paramount. Secret Service moved him from the school to Air Force One within minutes of the second tower being hit. The presidential limousine sped to the airport. Bush boarded the plane, which took off immediately, climbing sharply and flying without a filed flight plan. For hours, Bush was airborne. Air Force One flew to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, then to Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, zigzagging across the country while the Secret Service determined whether Washington was safe. There were reports, later proven false, of additional hijacked planes, reports of car bombs at the State Department, reports of threats against Air Force One itself, though those were never substantiated. Bush wanted to return to Washington immediately. Secret Service refused. The vice president was in a bunker under the White House. The continuity of government protocols were activated. For several hours, the American president was essentially in hiding, flying in circles over the Midwest while the nation tried to understand what was happening. If terrorists had targeted Bush specifically, if one of those planes had been aimed at the motorcade in Florida, or if Air Force One had been targeted while Bush was en route to the airport, or if the school itself had been attacked, September 11th becomes a different kind of catastrophe. Not just a terrorist attack, but a decapitation strike against American leadership. Bush was never in serious danger, probably, but the uncertainty that morning was profound. Nobody knew how many planes were hijacked, Nobody knew what the targets were. Nobody knew if more attacks were coming. For those hours in the air, Bush's survival was a matter of mobility, security protocols, and the fact that Al Qaeda had chosen symbolic buildings over hunting the president. Dick Cheney would have taken over if Bush had been killed. Cheney was already effectively running things from the bunker, ordering fighters to intercept potentially hostile aircraft, coordinating the government's response. Would President Cheney have responded differently than President Bush? Almost certainly. Cheney was more hawkish, more willing to use aggressive tactics, more focused on expanding executive power. The Iraq War might have happened sooner or differently or with even less international support. The War on Terror might have been more brutal, more expansive, more authoritarian, or maybe things would have proceeded basically the same, just with Cheney's face instead of Bush's. We don't know because Bush survived September 11th. He landed in Washington that evening, gave a televised address to the nation, and launched the War on Terror that would define his presidency and reshape American foreign policy for decades. History was rewritten that morning, but the ending could have been far worse. The attacks killed nearly 3,000 people. They destroyed the Twin Towers. They damaged the Pentagon. They traumatized the nation and changed the 21st century. But they didn't kill the president, and that omission, whether intentional or simply a matter of logistics and targeting priorities, meant that the American government continued functioning, that the chain of command remained intact, that the response, however flawed, came from elected leadership rather than chaos. Bush's survival wasn't heroic. It was logistical. He was in Florida, reading to children when the attacks began. He flew in circles for hours while others made decisions. But he lived, and his living meant continuity, however imperfect. History was rewritten that morning, but the ending could have been far worse. And the final chapter brings us to a modern scare, invisible, viral, and political. Joe Biden, the pandemic presidency, 2021-2024. Joe Biden became president on January 20th, 2021, which was either terrible timing or perfect timing, depending on your perspective. The COVID-19 pandemic was raging. Vaccines existed, but distribution was chaotic. Americans were dying at the rate of thousands per day, and Biden, at 78 years old, was the oldest person ever inaugurated as president, placing him squarely in the highest risk category for COVID mortality. This is not hyperbole. In January 2021, if you were over 75 and contracted COVID-19, your chances of dying were approximately 10-15%, even with hospital care. Biden was 78, had a history of brain aneurysms requiring surgery in 1988, and was about to take the most stressful job on earth during a global health crisis. The actuarial tables were not encouraging. He contracted COVID twice, once in July 2022, once in July 2024. Both times he experienced mild symptoms, congestion, fatigue, slight fever. Both times he was treated with Paxlovid, an antiviral medication that reduces COVID severity in high-risk patients. Both times he recovered within days and resumed normal activities. This is where medical science becomes a presidential near-death story. In March 2020, before vaccines and effective treatments existed, Biden catching COVID would have been potentially fatal. His age, his health history, the lack of treatment options, everything pointed towards serious illness at minimum, possible death at maximum. But by 2021, we had vaccines. By 22, we had Paxlovid and monoclonal antibodies and a healthcare system that, while strained, knew how to treat COVID. Biden's survival wasn't luck, it was timing. He got sick after the science caught up, after the tools existed to keep high-risk patients alive. If Biden had died of COVID during his presidency, Kamala Harris becomes president. The first woman president, the first black woman president, the first Asian American president, all at once, and not through election, but through tragedy and disease. Harris's presidency would have been historic but complicated, legitimacy questioned by some, symbolic to others, and entirely different in tone and policy from Biden's. The 2024 election changes completely. Does Harris run as the incumbent? Does she face a primary challenge? Do Republicans approach the race differently? The entire political landscape shifts based on whether an 80-year-old man's immune system, bolstered by medical science, can fight off a respiratory virus. Biden survived both infections. He served his term, chose not to run for re-election in 2024, eventually, and became a historical footnote as the president who led the country out of the pandemic's worst phase. Whether his leadership was effective is debatable. The pandemic's end had more to do with viral evolution, vaccine coverage, and accumulated immunity than any single policy. But his survival mattered. Not because he was uniquely essential, Harris could have governed, the country would have continued, but because his survival meant stability, continuity, the absence of yet another crisis during a period already defined by crisis. The pandemic was, in a sense, an assassination attempt by biology, an indiscriminate killer that targeted the elderly, the vulnerable, the unlucky. Biden was elderly and vulnerable, but he was also vaccinated, treated promptly, and protected by the best medical care available. He survived because science gave him tools that previous generations didn't have. In a different era, even just a few years earlier, Biden's age and the pandemic would have been incompatible with survival. Presidents would have been expected to die from respiratory diseases in their late 70s. Franklin Roosevelt died at 63 from cerebral hemorrhage and heart disease. Eisenhower had multiple heart attacks. Reagan was shot and nearly died. Biden got COVID twice and tweeted about it from isolation. The world held its breath, and for once, the ending was quiet. No dramatic hospital scenes, no last-minute recoveries, just an old man with a virus, treated with antiviral medication, recovering at home, and returning to work. It was anticlimactic, which, in presidential near-death experiences, is the best possible outcome. The world held its breath, and for once, the ending was quiet. And that brings us to the present. 45 presidents, 45 near-death experiences, and somehow, against all odds and common sense, a continuous government that's lasted nearly 2.5 centuries. So the next time you wonder how we made it this far, just remember, our entire history is held together by bad aim, dumb luck, bulletproof speeches, and at least one man who survived because he happened to be carrying 50 pages of political rhetoric in his pocket. George Washington was nearly killed by his own doctors. Andrew Jackson carried a bullet in his chest for 39 years out of pure spite. Theodore Roosevelt got shot and complained about it for 90 minutes while bleeding internally. And Jimmy Carter's presidency was wounded by a swimming rabbit with visible teeth. History isn't just the stuff they carve into monuments. It's weird. It's random. It's full of moments where everything could have gone differently if someone's aim had been better, or if a submarine had been 5 minutes slower, or if a mushroom had been slightly more poisonous. We're here because of luck and timing and the fact that occasionally the universe decides to let history continue instead of ending it over something stupid like spoiled cherries or a really long speech in bad weather. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, be grateful you're not a president. Be grateful nobody's trying to shoot you, poison you, or write conspiracy theories about your encounters with aquatic mammals. And if you wake up tomorrow, consider it a victory because for 45 presidents, waking up tomorrow was never guaranteed. Sleep well. History will still be weird in the morning.